Testing. That's why I got that. There we go. How about now? Testing 1, 2. Okay, we're recording. I'll give people 1 or 2 more minutes to filter in, but I don't imagine anybody else has shown up today. So, okay, how's everybody feeling for their second assignment? The one with the lapse and the timer and the checkpoint. Is there anything that you want to review for that today before we proceed with user interfaces? Which error? Sorry. Yeah. The problem, I guess, would be the easy solution is you just delete your variable and make it again. Yeah. Okay, well, it's going to be a pretty short expansion on user interfaces today, so we'll have some time at the end of class to work through any bugs that you're having. Okay. Yeah, last class we made this user interface here where we're displaying our time as well as the lap counter. We're going to just apply some best practices to what we've done here today and go over how to do some animations with user interfaces. So the first issue that I have with the user interface that I've put together is it's monolithic. Do you guys know what that means? Monolithic? Okay, it means every piece of this, so our lap counter, our timer, anything else that we put on here, if we want to expand this, it's all in one big giant class, right? So a monolith is like a giant monument, right? So it's a good idea to kind of break these individual elements out into smaller self-contained classes. And we can do that. It's actually very easy. So I'm going to come here to my content browser, move my details panel over, just get a little bit more space. And just to recap how we create user interface elements. So here we are in our content browser. We're going to right click. We're going to go to the bottom of the list here for user interface, and we're going to select widget blueprint. I suppose I should stop. Does everybody have Unreal up and running, or is it still taking a minute for you guys? Okay, we'll pull it off for 1 minute then. Okay, so again, just to go over what I just did, I right-clicked, created a user interface element, selected widget blueprint, and then there's only one parent class that you can really pick from, and it's this user widget. And in this case, I want to take this like lap counter widget that I made here, where we're displaying how many laps the player has completed, and just move it into its own separate class. Right, so I right-clicked, user interface, widget blueprint, user widget. And in my case, I just called it lap counter. And I'll suffix this with your section to keep myself organized. Okay. So if I double click and open this up, you'll see this should be familiar. This is our user interface designer grid here, right? So one thing I can do, I believe I can do it this way, is once you've kind of prototyped out your user interface element, I'm just going to go to the kind of big UI that I made. I'm going to grab my full user interface element, and I'm going to Control C to copy and Control V to paste. And you can see now I've pasted it in here, right? Now, the first issue that I have is now my lap counter widget is the size of the entire screen. So that's something that we're going to need to fix to kind of make it a smaller piece that we can drag and drop onto our user interface. So you can see up at the top right of our designer here, we have these two drop downs for screen size and fill screen. So if you click on screen size, you'll see all of the different devices and presets that Unreal Engine has for user interfaces. So if you want to preview your user interface on any of these devices, you can. By default, I think it just sizes itself to whatever your screen size is. Like it'll go access your system, say how big is this monitor, make user interfaces for this monitor, right? Finally, here we have this fill screen. So by default, every widget you create is going to assume that it is meant to fill the entire screen, the entire monitor. But you can also say custom. And now you can see you can just set the width and height of your user interface element in pixels. Or you can see these little two arrows at the bottom here. You can click and drag to size it this way. And what's nice about doing it this way is it'll show you how big it will be relative to the size of all of these different standard monitor sizes. So you have like your big 4K monitor there. You have your 1080p, and it'll also snap to those sizes if you want. We're not really going to be worrying about scalable user interfaces in this class. That's just kind of beyond what we can deal with. And I certainly would never evaluate you on that. Right, so here I'm just going to size it to about the size we were at, because we know that this size is good because we've already placed it here. And again, I'm just switching between my two widgets here by clicking on these tabs. If you remember what we did last class, we bound the contents of this lap counter here. We bound whatever the text that it will display to the output of this function here. So get lap counter text. And you can click on this little magnifying glass to go to the function you defined. And here it is. We grab our game mode. We grab our laps completed, laps to win, yada, 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 right? I want to do something a little bit more interesting with this lap counter though. Right, so we have our lap counter where it says laps, and then it will display like 1/3. What I want this thing to do though is when the player completes a lap, I want, as this number changes, I want it to kind of help someone to get bigger and then go back to its regular size. Little animations like this will help make your user interface feel good, right? Just add points of visual interest. So to do that, I might want to break up this text thing here into two text components, one for the current lap that we're currently on, and the one just like out of the total number of laps. So I'm just going to say Control C and Control V. And you can see that this is a vertical box, right? So as I copied and pasted it, it put it vertically beneath this element. So I'm going to take these two lap counter elements and put them into a horizontal box, right? Because I want them to be next to one another horizontally. So I'm going to come up to my palette here and search for horizontal box. And these are just all of the different panels and ways you have to lay things out in your menu are in the panels drop down in your palette. Okay. So I'm going to add this horizontal box, my vertical box, grab my two lap counter texts and just drag them onto my horizontal box here. To help clean this up, I'm going to name these things. So this text element is going to display the total laps. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. It's going to display the total laps. And this text element is going to display the current lap, right? This makes sense what we've done so far, right? We've kind of created a separate widget blueprint. We changed the size from fill screen to custom. And in this case, because I want to do a little animation on one piece of my text, I, what do you call it? I set this, I broke this into two different text components and put them into a horizontal box. This is kind of hard to read right now, so just to keep things clean, I'm going to manually set the text and make sure that it is going to align itself the way I want it to. Right, so I just put a number and out of 3 here. So the first thing I notice is that this looks like garbage, right? They're not aligned correctly. You would want them to be flush right next to one another. And we went over alignment very briefly in our last class, but anytime you have something inside of a container, you have these alignment settings here in your details panel, which just controls where the element will sit relative to other elements in the container. So in this case, I want this one to be kind of flush with this 3. So I can come in here and kind of play around. All right, so that one's aligned to the right. This one is aligned to the left. And yeah, okay, that looks pretty good. I can try setting it to auto. This will make it so they only take up like the minimum amount of space that they need versus fill, which will make it try to fill the entire container. Okay. Let's look at where we look at what our reference was. If I press play. Okay, yeah, they were kind of flush to the left. They weren't exactly centered, so I want to kind of keep that going. So I'm going to grab both of these elements and just set them to auto so that they stay on the left-hand side of the container. Okay. So right now I'm just setting these manually to just kind of visualize how it's going to look. But we need to bind these elements. Oops. Bind these elements to the values in our game mode, right? We have our total number of laps we need to win the race, and we have the current lap that we're on. I could go into my racing UI here and just copy and paste the function that I used before, but I'm going to go through it again just to make sure we all know how to do it, right? So let's start with like the total number of laps in the race here. So I'm going to select this. You can see I've set my text just here to /3, and I just set this manually by going into the details panel and typing in /3. But you can see this drop down here that says bind. I'm going to click this drop down and create a binding. If you hover over it, it'll tell you what it does. It creates a new function on the widget blueprint that will return the binding data for this property. And get total laps text. Good enough. That's a reasonable enough name. Okay. So we know that our game mode is the object that has all of the information that we need here. I'll just go through this again. You right click and you say get game mode. It's the core value of using a game mode. Every single blueprint can do this. You just say get our game mode to get all of the information stored on it. And we need to make sure that we're treating the game mode as though it is the game mode of the type we defined. So we cast to our game mode, right? Cast to. Okay. You can see it returns this blue object pin, which is an object reference to our game mode. Okay. And we can say get laps to win. There we go. That was what we called our variable, get total laps to win. And then we need to format this message a little bit. So we need to format a string that will return slash and then this value. And we went over this function last class, but you can right click and say append string. Append string. This is how you concatenate strings. Append string. Right? You can see we have these pins here, A and B. And you can add more pins if you want to make a more interesting message. If you want to remove a pin, you right click, remove pin. I believe there's always a minimum of 2. So I'm just going to put slash and then the laps to win, like so. Then I'm going to take the output, that's my string here, and plug it into the return value of my function. And what this does is make sure that this here will always display the output of this function. Right? So as values change, as the player's speed goes up and down, if you want to display the player's speed in real time, you would bind a display to show the player's speed. That is an optional element for our user interface, but we're going to go over it today in class. Okay. Binding. Realistically, this is the extent of the code that you need to, of like the nodes and code you need to write to complete the third assignment. If you can do this, right, get your game mode, cast it to the game mode, get the variable that you want, plug it into the return node of a bound function. Okay. So go to my designer here. Here we've defined our /3. We're going to do the same thing for the lap that we're on. So we're going to grab this text element here. Right now we just have it set to display 1. Click binding. You can see we have the function that we've defined here for total laps text. So if you want to bind multiple things to the same function, you can do that. If I'm going to create another binding, you can say get current lap text. Right? Automatically takes you to the function. I'm just going to open up my total laps text here and copy this. So get game mode cast to and paste it here. And then I'm going to, I believe we call it get lap. Get laps completed. Now, in our case, if we haven't completed any laps, this is going to return 0. So we never really want, like, we want our widget to display the lap that we are in the process of completing, which is never 0. If we're on lap 0, we're in the process of completing the first lap. So we're going to add 1, right? Plus 1. And then we can just plug that in there. Unreal Engine is very kind. It automatically converts common variable types between one another if you just try and plug the pins in. Okay. The main thing, even if you're not following along, even if you've fallen behind, you're not sure, the main thing I want you to get out of what I've just done is binding. Select the user interface thing. In our case, it's a text element. Click on the drop-down, create a binding. You want to bind the color, you can bind the color. You want to bind anything, really. the shadow, like how long the shadows are. You can, everything that has a bind menu, you can update in real time based on another value. Okay. Okay. So the next thing I wanted was when I complete a lap, I want, this is obvious, hopefully should update automatically, but I also want it to grow, like do a little animation where it just like gets bigger for a second and then goes back to normal size. Okay. So at the bottom here, we have our content drawer, our output log, our command, but we also have this animations tab. Animations. And if you click on this, it'll open up this menu at the bottom. I recommend clicking this button here to dock it in your layout. Because if I click off of this now, you'll see I lose my animations tab. I've already docked it, but you can see click dock in layout, and it'll just make your animation tab stay here, even if you click somewhere else, right? So you click animations at the bottom. There's this button on the right-hand side, dock in layout, and click dock in layout. And that way you just don't lose the menu if you ever click somewhere else on your user interface. Okay. And you'll see right now we have no animations programmed for this user interface. Right. So I'm just going to click plus animation here. Plus animation. And you can see it's just created this animation called new animation. Don't call your animations new animation. We're animating, this is our animation we want to play when a lap is completed. So I'm going to call this lap completed animation. And when I select this animation in the list, you can see we now have this blue outline that says selected lap completed animation. And that just means we're previewing this animation. So we can see what it's going to look like. We can make it go play it forward, play in reverse, play at different speeds. Anyway, so with this selected, like if I deselect this, you'll see this is grayed out and says no animation selected. But if I select it, now this window here is available, right? And this is what's called a keyframe animation editor. Has anybody here ever done like video editing or stuff like that? In high school, probably took like a course on Adobe Premiere or Avid or something? No? Okay. Well, basically, this is a timeline, right? So we start here at 0 seconds. And if I press play here, it'll go and go for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? These kind of wings here represent the total length of the animation. You can extend the animation to make it longer, and you can shrink it to make it shorter. By clicking on this plus track button here, it's going to add user interface elements and properties that we can animate. So I'm going to click plus track, and you can see this is why we like to name our stuff. We can see our current lap text element here. I'm going to select that. So here we have our current lap text element. And right now, it's still not doing anything. And that's because all of these elements here on the right-hand side in the details panel, we need to select which ones we want to animate, right? If it automatically assumed we were animating every single one of these elements, this menu would be way too busy. It would be craziness. So I'm going to click plus on this track button here. So I'm going to select my current lap here and click plus here. And now you can see all of the different stuff that we can animate on our user interface element. So in my case, I want to animate the transform because I just want it to get bigger and then smaller. I'm going to click that transform button. And you can see now we have this little drop down here and this orange dot. This orange dot is called a keyframe. And a keyframe just represents kind of a state, right? So in our case, if I expand this, I'm going to look at the scale. the X and Y scale are 1, right? I'm going to expand this animation a little bit. So unfortunately, when you add an element, you can see it's kind of nothing going on. But if I hover over, if I can zoom in and find the keyframe here, if I hover over this, I can click and kind of expand the animation a little bit. I'm going to make this animation a little bit longer. I'm going to make it, because by default, it just goes to like a really short, like 2-second animation. I'm going to make this maybe 2 seconds. There's no hard and fast rule for how long an animation should be. If you're not sure, look at some reference, right? Do some research, find some animations you like, time them. And then we have these wings here. I'm just going to click on it and it's going to match the length of this animation, right? Unfortunately, this is where it gets just a little bit buggy. So whenever you create an animation, like an element to animate, sometimes it'll just snap and make it like 0 seconds and you have to manually set the length of the animation as opposed to just staying at the animation's length, right? So here at 0 seconds, our X and Y scale are 1. I'm going to move this little handle here to the end of my animation because I want it to get bigger and then go back to its original size. I'm going to click this plus button and it says add a new keyframe at the current time. Right, it's still not really changing. Nothing's going on. Now I'm going to go to the middle of my animation. So it's 2 seconds long. I'm going to go to the 1 second time here. I'm going to increase my scale. I'm going to say like 1.5 and 1.5. Maybe a little bigger, 2 and 2. Okay, that's a little too big. And in terms of the values I'm putting in here, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. There's no right answer, right? And you can see I did this. And now if we play our animation, it gets bigger and then goes back to normal. You can play it in reverse. This is not mandatory for your assignments. I just think it's kind of fun and interesting to play with animations, right? So this is how keyframe animation works. You add an element, you create an animation, you add a track for whatever element you want to animate, and then you add a subtrack for the property of that element that you want to animate. You can animate the font, you can animate the color, you can animate the size, right? There's all kinds. You can animate the opacity if you want something to fade in. You can animate the render opacity from 0 to 1. There's all kinds of different things that you can create. That's the one that we've just created as an example. Okay. I'm going to go to the graph here, right? So I'm in my designer. I'm going to come over here to my graph. So this is where we're going to add some code to this user interface element. Okay. Right now, it's still taking us to this function, but if I just quit this function here, we have our event graph, right? This should look familiar to you from all of the blueprinting that we've done so far in this course. The only difference is these events are named different things. So event tick is event tick. You know what that is. Event construct is like begin play. This is like when we build our user interface, when we create this object, we're going to call this construct function. And then pre-construct, don't worry about that. We don't need to think about that. It's called basically before we create our user interface, and it's called whenever you make changes in the editor. You don't need to think about that right now. Okay, so out of our event construct, we need to find some way to play this animation whenever we complete a lap. Now, we know that we have our lap completed event coming off of our game mode, right? So I can do the same thing that I did in these bound functions. I can get game mode cast to BP underscore whatever you've named your game mode, right? Now, personally, I don't like to repeat code very often if I can avoid it. And so far, we've had this thing here called 3 times, right? We've called this get game mode, cast to BP, race game mode 3 different times, once here and once in each of these functions. So what I'm going to do here is where we have this object as BP race game mode FS2. I'm just going to click on this object, drag it onto my graph and release, and I'm going to promote my game mode to a variable. And we can just call this like race game mode, right? And now, probably do this in a minute, I can go back into these functions and refactor these to use this variable instead of these nodes here. So this way, we're just like, when we create our user interface, we're getting an object reference to our game mode and setting it as a variable, so that any other time that we're using our game mode, any other time we need to access information on it, we don't need to remember get game mode cast to this. We can just grab our variable. Does that make sense? Okay. We'll do this in a second. We will do that in a moment. And then once we do that, out of our race game mode variable here, we need to somehow bind an event to our event dispatcher, right? So I can say to bind to event on lap complete. Bind to event on lap complete. And I can click and drag off of this red node here and add a custom event, right? So I clicked and dragged off of this blue node here. Bind to event on lap complete. Now, if I compile this, it's going to fail because this requires a reference to a delegate. You cannot bind a null reference to an event. It's not how it works. And I'm going to add a custom event. Right, add custom event. And I'm going to call this play lap complete animation. Okay. Does this make sense to everybody so far, right? If you followed along with the last couple of lectures, the idea of an event dispatcher and binding to an event should be fairly straightforward, right? This would be like, and if we're adding code, we have our online, it would be like game mode dot on lap complete plus equals play lap complete animation, right? You've probably seen syntax like this in C# and C++, maybe a little in JavaScript, right? We're basically saying, hey, we have this event and we are adding this delegate. This is now a listener, right? It's listening for this event. Now we have our play lap complete animation event here. If we go to the left-hand side to the my blueprint function here, you can see it's created a variable for us for the animation that we defined. We made this lap complete animation. Now it's a variable that we can use. I can click and drag this into my graph and get it. And using this, I can click and drag and release, and I'll say play animation. Play animation. And then I'll hook it up so that when this event triggers, when we complete a lap, we will play this animation. And you can see all of the parameters that we can modify this animation with. We can play it forwards or backwards, or ping pong, which makes it keep playing forwards and backwards in sequence. How many times do you want it to loop? What time do you want it to start at? And how fast do you want it to play? And finally, this one, restore state, is whenever the animation stops, do you want it to basically go back to the state that it was before you played the animation, or do you want it to maintain the state of wherever it ended in the animation? Okay, and we have our play animation. Okay, so now we've created this kind of subcomponent that just manages our lap counter as its own separate widget blueprint that we can now, I'm going to go back to that main user interface that we created last class. This is our main racing user interface. And here you can see we have our lap counter. This is like the old one that we made with the vertical box. I'm going to grab all of these and I'm just going to delete them because we don't need them anymore. And in my racing UI, I prefaced all of my widget blueprints with WBP. You can see all of the custom widgets that I've made, not just for your section, but for all of the sections. Here's the lap counter FS2 that I just made, right? So user created widgets are available to kind of nest inside of other widgets. And widget is just another word for user interface element, right? So I can now click and drag my lap counter into my game, like so. Now memory serves, I anchored this to the bottom left. And I can just kind of place this where I would have placed it, about here. Okay. So now, if all goes well, and I press play, you can see I have my user interface element. We're on lap 1 out of 2. I'm going to go ahead and complete a lap here. So I'm going to go through my 2 checkpoints, then through my starting line. And you can see it plays the animation and updates. Right? This is a key example of why you use events. Why events is like an architecture, not just for games, but for all software. It is an essential thing to understand, right? Because now we have our user interface and our game mode and our checkpoints and all of these different things that can listen for when a lap is completed, that can listen for key events that occur in our game, in your software. Okay? Crystal clear. I hope that's clear enough. Clear as mud, right? So a good habit to get into is if you have kind of small pieces, so in my case, a lap counter, another great example would be this timer up at the top here. Be a good idea to break this out into a separate user interface element. Okay. And you break them up into smaller pieces and put all of your animations and all of your kind of encapsulated behavior into these smaller classes. This goes to something, again, called single responsibility principle. Each class should have a clear single responsibility. So in our case, our racing user interface, its responsibility is just to assemble and show all of the elements. The responsibility of this one is to track the number of laps and to listen for and play any animations that are related to the number of laps being completed. You know, if we broke this one off, it would be responsible for playing stuff related to the time, right? Hope this makes sense. Not just what I've done, but why I'm doing it this way. That's what I hope you take away from this. Okay. Let's tackle the optional part of the assignment. This is part of the third assignment where you have an optional thing that you can do if you want to display the player's speed, right? The reason I made this optional is because it is very tricky. It's actually like requires a bit of understanding of physics, of math, that I honestly don't know if most of the class has. My understanding is like most of the people in this program don't have a background in calculus, physics, linear algebra, stuff like that. That's the understanding that you need to kind of think through this problem and approach it. I'm going to go to user interface here. So I'm going to right click on my content browser, user interface, widget blueprint. I'm going to create another user widget. I'm going to call this WBP speedometer. FS2. I'm going to double click and open it up. And you see back in our widget, our designer, I'm going to go instead of fill screen just to custom because I want to make this its own like custom little small element I can drag and drop. And then I guess I'm going to drag a vertical box here. See right now it's 100 by 100. I'm just going to make it like this kind of maybe rectangular shape like so. I'm just going to grab a text element, right? I want to display some text to show how fast the player is moving. And I'm going to anchor it to the bottom, like so, bottom center. So just like we did with our lap display, we need to bind this value to the speed of the player. We go ahead and go to bind, create binding. I'll preface this by saying if I were to do this on a larger project, I'd probably put a lot of this code on the player and not on this user interface element. But just for the purposes of getting this done quickly, you can put it here. So just like we got the game mode, right? We said get game mode, cast to game mode of our type, right? We can also get the player in the same way. I can right click and say get player pawn. Get player pawn, right? So a pawn is it's a type of actor that a player can control. That's all it is. It's an actor that has an extension on it that says, hey, listen for player input. That's all it does. Get player pawn. And you see it returns this pawn object reference. And I'll show you that if I go to my template, to my blueprints, to my cart, I'm going to double click and open my cart. You can see that the parent class is a pawn. I have to close that down. And just like we said, treat our high level game mode as the game mode we defined, we need to do the same thing with our pawn. We need to say cast to BP underscore cart. Cast to BP underscore cart. And we get an object reference to our cart. Now we need to somehow find a way to calculate the player's speed. This is tricky, right? So if I just go in here and say get speed, it's not like there's no easy function to do this. We have to figure out how fast the player is going ourselves. What I can do is I can say get velocity. Get velocity. And you can see it says returns the velocity in centimeters per second, so unreal units per second, of the root component if it is either using physics or has an associated movement component. I can say get velocity. So the difference between speed and velocity is a little bit tricky, right? So if anybody's taken Physics 101, velocity is a direction with a magnitude, right? It's a vector. So let's see if this, here we go. So here we have our 3D grid, right? and we have something that is moving in this 3D grid. It has a velocity, right? So we'll say, let's say the player's at like 1, 1, that's their coordinates. And they have a velocity of something like this, right? And so the vector that it would return would be like, I guess, be like 10, 10, 3, something like this. Right? Because kind of this is where they are, but then this is how fast they're going. It's like the length of the vector, right? It's a tricky thing to grasp. But what you need to understand is that velocity is basically the direction and speed of the player. So we need to somehow get the speed from the velocity. And we can do that just by getting kind of the length of that arrow, right? So we don't really care about what direction they're moving. We just care about how fast they're moving. So out of this, we can click and drag. So we have our get velocity vector. It returns a vector. You can type in vector length. You can also see this vector length xy. This might be a better one, right? Because when we're thinking about the velocity of our car and the speed we want to display, if our car's bouncing up and down, like if you guys, who here has your license, right? Everyone here has driven a car before once or twice. When you're driving, if your car is bouncing up and down, what does your speedometer display? 0. Doesn't display anything, right? Because you're not moving forward or backwards. So we can either grab the vector length and do some operations on that to isolate the xy components, or we can just grab the vector length xy. You can see now it's returned a float value. I'm just going to plug this float value into this text node here. All right, so now we have this speedometer widget with a text element, and the content of that text element is bound to the speed of our player, or rather the magnitude of their velocity. I'm going to go back to my main user interface here. I can say WVP speedometer, the widget we just created. I'm going to click and drag that onto my user interface. I might need to compile my speedometer, and here's our text block now. And I can kind of scale this up to how big I need it to be. I'm going to do this for now. Put it in the bottom right-hand corner. If I wanted to be really diligent, I would put my lap counter and my speedometer in a horizontal box to make sure that they're aligned. But for now, let's just make sure that it's working, and we'll make it pretty later. Okay. Now if I press play, oh, it might not. Okay, exit. Let me check my world settings, BP cart. It's my speedometer. Get anchored to the bottom and see if this is working. Why is it not showing? Okay, here it is. You can see we're moving super slowly. This is because it's measuring our speed in centimeters per second. And as we kind of come to a stop, it gradually comes down to pretty close to 0. Because this is measuring such small movements, even if we're just kind of inching forward, it's still going to display something, right? Because it's measuring it in centimeters per second. This is a very minute measurement. Typically, we don't measure the speed of cars in centimeters per second. We measure it in kilometers per hour. So let's do a little bit of math here to convert I'm going to open up my speedometer widget again. So in my case, I just minimized my blueprint window. I'm going to open it back up again. Here's my speedometer window. I'm going to go to my function. So again, I have my text selected. We have this bound function to our text. I'm going to click this little magnifying glass. And it's going to take me to my function. Let's do a little math to convert this into, in our case, kilometers per second. And then we'll do a little bit of math to convert it to kilometers per hour. So to convert centimeters to kilometers, I believe we multiply by 0.0001. Believe that's right. It's been a while since I've done my metric conversion tables, but I think that's right. Might need an extra zero in there, but I'm pretty sure that's the right one, right? You can see displaying kilometers per second, which is way too small, right? 0.22 kilometers per second. That's not right. We can then take the output of this and multiply it by 60. Now it's kilometers per minute. We can either copy and paste this and make it kilometers per hour, or we can add another pin to our multiplication node, times 60 times 60. Now it is kilometers per hour. Oof. In our case, we're moving pretty quick. 700 kilometers per hour, crazy fast, right? We might want to format this a little bit more. Personally, I don't like the float. I don't like that it has decimal points sitting after it. We never see kilometers per hour measured with a decimal point like that. So we can grab our float and we can either round it, or what I prefer is truncating it, which just automatically rounds it down. Truncating rounds down. We're going to truncate our float. And now let's see what it shows. I think I might have misdone my multiplication table. I might need another zero here. 0.00001. 700 seems a little high. Okay, that looks more like it. That's more of a reasonable number. And so it looks like we're capping out at about 80 kilometers per hour, right? 80 kilometers. So once we've done this, we know that we're kind of capping out at around 80. I don't really want to get into the physics of how to calculate the player's max speed, because that's honestly kind of hard and I just hack at it most of the time. So I'm going to go back to my speedometer here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my player pawn, cast a BP cart, get velocity, get vector length, all this multiplication, and truncate. I'm going to right click. I could convert this to a function. Yeah, this is a little tricky because I might want to store this as a variable to do like a, like a, what do you call it? Like the arrow, like some kind of bar that fills as the player goes faster, right? So let's add like a bar here. So we have something called a progress bar. If I drag this in, you can see it's this horizontal bar like this. I don't really like that one. We also have a radial slider like this. This one I find just looks a little better for a speed measurement here. Okay. And if we select our radial slider and we come here to value, right? The slider value to display, and I turn this up, you can see that the slider fills up. When the value is set to 1, it's filled. When the value is set to 0, it's not. Okay. So we can bind this value. If we know the player's maximum speed and can get the player's current speed, then we can just divide the current by the maximum speed to get a value between 0 and 1 that represents how fast the player is going. So for this, I'm just going to grab all of this stuff here and convert it to a function. So I'm going to grab so I'm going to go back to my get text function here for where we're displaying the player's speed. I'm going to grab all of this. I'm going to right click and say convert to function or collapse to function here. It's called new function. I'm just going to call this get player speed in kilometers per hour. And in this return value, I'm going to promote this to a variable and say player speed kmh. And this is just so I can get this value somewhere else. You can always go back and refactor this. Like I might want to move this outside of this bound function, make it so I don't cast every single frame. So like just converting the player to a variable would be a good way to refactor this. Might do that in a minute. But for now, I'm just going to do this. Then I'm going to go to my radial bar here. So I'm going back to my designer with this menu up at the top. I'm going to bind my value here. I'm going to create binding. And you can see we have this float that is returning. I'm going to grab my player speed. I'm going to divide it by 80. I might actually convert this to a float so that it returns a float value, 80. Right. So the way that I did that is I have this player speed. I said divide. And by default, it'll try and divide it by another integer. We want to divide it by a float so that it returns a float. So you can right click here. And you can say pin conversions. I'm going to say to float. So divide this integer by a float. We know that we were capping out at around 80. This is a very hacky way of doing this. A better way of doing it would be to somehow calculate the player's max speed. I haven't done that yet. I'm still figuring out an accurate way of doing it. But for now, you just kind of get in, you drive your car. Okay, we get up to about 80. 80 is our max speed. There we go. Oh, current value B is invalid. Expect a valid. Oh, okay, that's why. And get rid of that. To float. 80.0. Why is that giving me an error? Oh, okay, there we go. Weird. Weird. Right? We're dividing it by 80, and we're returning that value. So this should return a value between 0 and 1, depending on how close the player's speed gets to 80 kilometers an hour. So if I press play again, you can see now we have that radial bar there. Now if I start going forward, it doesn't seem to be filling up. It could be an issue with the color. So right now it's gray on gray. So let's see if we can just change the color to make sure that we're seeing what's going on. So I'm going to go back to my designer. I'm going to select my radial slider here. I'm going to change the slider progress bar to red, just so we can very clearly see what's going on. I would wager that this is an issue with how I'm defining my variables. So let's refactor a little bit to help this be a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to grab my text block and go to my get text function. I'm going to grab my get player speed and set player speed, and I'm just going to hit Control X. Go to my event graph and hit Control V. And put it onto my event tick. Let's just move it outside of this function and see if that solves it. And then in our get player speed, or rather, what do you call it? Get text, we can then just plug this variable in like so. Hopefully this works. We'll see. This is why this is optional, frankly, because I got this working in the other section. See if this works here. Oh. Our Unreal Engine wants to crash, which is another possibility. Okay, any questions about getting the player's speed? It's not mandatory. You don't have to do it for your assignment. Does it kind of make sense how we're getting the player's speed? Right, we're getting their velocity, which is their speed and direction, and just getting rid of the direction and magnitude of their movement, and we're just kind of getting rid of the direction and just getting the magnitude of their movement. Oh, we're getting a little compiler error. Make literal float. Try this. That was not compiling. Okay, now it seems to be working. I don't know why, but now it is. All right, now we have this speedometer that has this kind of radial fill bar. As I go faster, it fills up. And as I slow down, it goes back to 0. Okay, that's all I really wanted to cover in class today. So any questions about your upcoming assignment that's due on the 7th? You have 20 minutes to answer any kind of questions, go over any issues you're having. We also have class on Friday as a review session. So if you're saying, hey, I'm 90% there, but my checkpoints aren't working, I'll be here to help you fix that. And if that's all, you're welcome to go. Otherwise, you're welcome to stay and work on your assignments. Ask me any questions. Here to help. Okay. Want to take a look at that Boolean error you were getting?
I guess, would be that your cast is failing. You can correct me.
My variable.
So out of the cast failed node, you can drag this out and string to see if the cast is failing. And you can copy and paste your return node so that it's returning a value even if the cast is failing. Because that would be my guess, is that the cast is failing, and so it's just never getting. Yeah, it's got to paste that from that there. And then maybe you can put it. I like putting my debug my nodes too, so it displays. Right, so yeah, your return node for when it fails, you can just get game mode. Fail, you can just type it in.
Oh, you're gonna just text, okay.
Okay, so it seems to be working out of three, right?
Yeah, no, that's the, oh, that's yeah, see, but that's it, exactly, so get total time.
Oh, yeah, yeah, bind the total amounts.
That's what it is. Yeah.
So it looks like if you go to total laughs, scroll down a little bit to your binding, your color and opacity. Probably in somewhere in appearance. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we're trying to bind the text value to your color and opacity. As we're binding.
Okay, so that's why I was working, but not, okay.
Yeah, it's basically saying like you're not returning a color and opacity value. You can't set color and opacity to text. What's going on? Yeah, it's all good.
Oh, that's the whole screen. Actually, one thing I really was curious about is I know I've, oh, but I know I've made a mess of like, I rather know how to like structure this, and for some reason I've got a few different spots where blueprints have gone. How should this be structured? So we have this blueprint on which we
Yeah.
put some in, but I probably just clicked the wrong thing at some point. And then there's template, which has some of
You
these
can
things.
just click and drag them into your own blueprints folder. So the template folder is just for all of the stuff I've provided. You can like expand, like as long as it's consistent, I don't really care. You can put it in the blueprints folder I created, template folder, or you can put it in.
But it would normally be like here, the content blueprints, that's where they normally should be,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah, for really large projects, it's typically broken up into modules.
Hmm.
So like, let's say, I'm doing this kart racer game. I would break it into like, okay, content, carts. And then in my carts, I have my blueprints, all of my static meshes, my textures, materials, yada, yada, yada. And then I might have another one for like, power ups, right?
Your materials, you wouldn't keep them in just the materials folder, you have materials for particular sets of objects. So I did start putting like, I have my farm objects and my racetrack objects, I was trying to separate them out, but you could also put them in your materials to match like wherever you structure them, but it wouldn't be under blueprints then, you'd have this like content, and then you'd have like,
Yeah,
I would put maybe my farm objects in content and then put, the blueprints and the materials and everything. all at once.
exactly.
Everything related to them, the sounds, all that kind of stuff, in subfolder and stuff, all that.
It depends on how complex your assets are, realistically. So like in a racing game, like this, for example, like, we have our kart racer. That kart racer might have its own animations, it might have its own materials, its own textures, its own static mesh and all of that. So I might have a folder for my characters because all of those assets I'm creating are kind of bespoke to the asset I'm making, right? But if I'm making assets that are generally more useful, so like a material that I'm applying to the asphalt and multiple things, then I would have that in its own kind of higher level separate materials folder. Again, it really depends. It depends on how big your project is. In our case, like if you have a blueprints folder and all your blueprints go in there,
But
that's,
yeah,
that's
just
clear.
like studying things that I should be studying. But as soon as I started. The controller or just different architecture in general with all of it, I'm all for that, like making sure everything's tidy because it drives me nuts. And I'm already driving myself nuts for this because I'm like, where did I put this? And then I keep going back to like, hey, where should I be putting some? I put some of them here and I put some of them here and I hate it. So I'm like, I need to stop doing that. But it still doesn't matter if I move all of these guys out of here, then the cards and ones you've already created, as long as it's something consistent under content and
Yeah, if
I
you
mean,
drag them all into your blueprints folder, it's fine.
I will restructure my stuff.
We'll see if it's working. Double check, make sure that it's,
Yeah, so text box over. I don't know, I missed, I gotta go back, I always go back to the recordings and see through everything.
yeah, again, this speedometer is optional, so like, if you get around to it, you get around to it. If you don't, you don't. It's not the end of the world. Yeah.
I'm like trying to do all the stuff that we cover, just sometimes I've gotta, whatever, I'm working on other stuff, I gotta get it done, and then I go back to it when I can get it on covered, but.
Yeah, of course, it's, you take it at your own pace. And as long as you get the